Yeah. Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's the most intriguing title. We've heard quite a few already, but certainly it's one that I hope resonates with you as it does with me. Any of you who've ever read Jeanette Winterson's wonderful novel, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, might recall its first sentences, which read, "Like most people, I lived for a long time with my mother and father. My father liked the wrestling, my mother liked to wrestle. It didn't matter what. She was in the white corner, and that was that." There are quite a few things about those sentences that make them marvelous, and I'll return to one of them. But I find myself most frequently paraphrasing the first one, so that it reads, "Like many people, I've lived for a long time with a husband." And when you've lived for a long time with anybody, you may find that they tend to say the same things over and over again, and quite frequently you find yourself hoping that they mean them in a tongue-in-cheek way. For years, my husband has been arguing that the National Library of Ireland has been marketing itself all wrong, and trying to offer as a masterstroke the following tagline. Don't tweet that. And while, as I say, I hope that he's joking, I think there is an interesting challenge there, a challenge that consists in the gulf there is between someone who's ever had tears in their eyes as they've moved through an archive and been moved in an archive, and the people who'd get tears in their eyes at the idea of being dragged over the threshold and forced to engage with the material in there, the people who think dusty old books, and I think you probably know who you are. And for those people, there's no point whatsoever in telling them that your collections are stellar and remarkable and extraordinary and moving. You have to find a way to share the feeling. So this was very much in our thinking as we embarked a couple of years ago on a major cataloguing and digitisation project for the Decade of Commemorations. We catalogued and digitised the papers of the 7 signatories of the 1916 Proclamation and of the women who were their partners in life and in conviction. 23,000 items in total, amounting to nearly 90,000 images. That's an enormous wealth of research material, but its very size and breadth verge on the off-putting, unless you're a really committed scholar. We knew that the dedicated historians could be reached relatively straightforwardly through our usual channels, and that they would be, and they were, eager for this material and immediately sold on it once it became available. Yet, we were also really conscious that the impetus and the messaging around the 1916 commemorations was about inclusivity and engagement, the proactive fostering of a sense that our national collections belonged to and were for everybody. We knew, too, that we'd be looking for media partners to help expand and amplify our promotional effort, and that the package of content we created to promote these research resources would have to resonate with their audiences. Our research resources, in other words, we saw them not just for that highly invoked figure, the serious researcher, but thinking that research collections are not just for researchers. And to look at that statement from another perspective, the idea that the category researcher is not fixed and immutable through a person's life. Think about the phases of research activity that the same person can work through over time. For instance, someone who finished their formal education at the age of 17, who in their 70s becomes a tireless and committed researcher into family history. And I think reflecting on it, that some of the value of the kind of work that we did was around constructing the category of researcher, not just as an identity, but also as an arena. So an arena where a much broader audience of people could observe that activity, could be interested in it, and crucially, could see it as a space that over time they themselves could step in and out of. A space that was not about exclusion or privileged categories, but about potential. So this brings us back again to the lines from Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. How vividly the narrator's father passively watching the wrestling, her mother bristling and spiky, eager for conflict, are conjured in just a few words. Their stories are sketched with enormous immediacy in those first perfect details. And it became obvious that it was through those luminous details that evoke an entire story, but also surprise or provoke in undermining a perception, that we would illuminate the fruits of research and make it meaningful for a large audience. I was really struck this morning by Lorcan's reference to the role of special collections and archives in active memory work in that context. Because one of the really interesting challenges with this particular context, the story of those who took on an empire and died, is that the story seems to be too well known. The individuals are no longer people, but archetypes, and the emotional obvious impact comes almost too easily. You can tip over into gratuitous sentiment, or alternatively, a numbing familiarity very quickly. And that's linked to another challenge around promoting through emotive, engaging stories, which is in fact itself a research problem. For me, it was a privileged and fantastic job to delve into this kind of archive, but I wouldn't underestimate the workload in getting to the precise items and the stories you think may resonate with audiences, and to balance that with the requirement, which all of us feel so much, which is to actually get the job done, and not give yourself up luxuriously to the yielding embrace of the archive, never to emerge again. In all of this, the metadata created as part of the digitisation project was a crucial first stage. Metadata helps you find things. Who knew? So what it meant for the selection of content that we were going to package and use for promotion, I'm going to explore that quickly through a look at the selection of material chosen to highlight for each signatory of the proclamation. A selection that was very much informed by the injunction that Katrina Crowe gave about complicating the narrative, making the story more complicated and more unexpected. The first selection that you see here represents the signatory Eamon Kant. And it's certainly the case that there's an immensely powerful item in his archive, which is the last letter that you see here. Written without doubt with an eye to posterity, as they all were, but also highly intimate and a nuanced glimpse of somebody whose reputation was as aloof and austere. In fact, when you look at the letter, he says, "My cold exterior was but a mask," writing to his wife the night before he was executed. And he says to her something that is extremely powerful and has a contemporary feel. He says to her, and you can see her there with Ronan, her son, "You have a duty to me and Ronan, and that is to live." He doesn't ask her to carry on his memory. He doesn't ask her to dedicate herself to being his widow, although for many of them that's how it turned out. He asks her to live. And that immensely powerful last piece is also contextualized by this glimpse of him from one of his notebooks as a creative person with a life that he wanted to live, this self-portrait, May Fain, showing that he wasn't just about the revolution and the propaganda of it. Similarly, Tom Clarke, grizzled O'Fenian, imprisoned. The shop that you see here, his tobacconist shop, was a centre for revolutionary activity in Dublin. There's a very particular idea that people have about Tom Clarke, but yet you see in this letter here that he wrote to his young son about a dog, that he says, I'm going to learn him, the dog, to sell tobacco and cigars, and also to sell newspapers in the street. So there's that suddenly silly, playful sense that turns him into a different character from the picture that you have from the framed images that surround so many images of the Proclamation. Joseph Plunkett is so tied into the romantic story, the tragic romance of his love for Grace Gifford and of their marriage the night before he was executed. And yet he's also someone who, alongside his mystic poetry, could write to his father, I'm a great poet, but unfortunately very few people know it. And to be forced to bring out a second edition is my ambition. With Thomas MacDonagh, you have these extraordinarily poignant photographs of himself, his wife, Grace Gifford's sister Muriel, and their young family, just a couple of short years before you know that that family will be destroyed. But there's also this, his doodlings, his scribblings on a National Library request slip, which explains, I guess, where request slips go, but are immediately relatable to everybody. Everybody's picked up a bit of paper and doodled or scribbled on it. And it creates a sense of a human person much stronger than some of the more immediately political material. James Connolly, he writes in this witness account given by his daughter Nora, when Nora and her mother come to see him in their last minutes, he says to his wife, hasn't it been a full life? And isn't this a good end? But you balance that poignancy with the first letters that he writes to Lily, his wife, where you can see he says, this is a love letter. This is a letter written to the nicest girl between here and anywhere. And what's funny is that he has other letters in that collection that say this is not a love letter, where they've obviously had a falling out and he's taking her to task. That rounded sense of a whole life lived. You have Patrick Pearse, here seen by O'Donovan Ross's grave after he's given his famous oration. And yet, alongside that kind of activity, you also have letters written by angry neighbours next door to St. Enda's, who were writing to him saying things like, today a plank passed over the wall from your ball alley to my garden. A boy came over and was about to return by the same means when he was stopped and compelled to go by the more roundabout but regular route by my wife, which he resented with language and a demeanour which I prefer not to describe. Imagine trying to run the revolution and deal with this kind of thing. But again, there is that human, warm, intimate sense emerging from the archives. And finally, with Sean McDiarmid, you have this piece written by his sisters after his death, where he says, may we all live to see a just punishment on England for all her crimes. No nuance there in terms of where the sisters sat, but it's also that sense of him not being this isolated, tragic figure, but part of a family who loved him and who missed him when he was gone. So with that right blend of stories identified, we pitched to the Irish Times and they ran with them as an extensive series, a feature piece on each signatory, a gallery of images linking back to our catalogue, and a video piece highlighting the sense of excitement and discovery of the research work. As you can see here, I do seem to be having a lot of feelings, although I'm not convinced that any of them are the sort that would bring in an audience rather than turn them away. But we do know that the reach of these pieces was much greater than we could have achieved without the amplifying platform. One of them had 23,000 views within the first 24 hours, and there was quite a bit of direct feedback on social media or through email, and people mentioning them when they came to our introductory research workshops. This was combined with the advantage of getting ourselves into the stream of people who might not have known anything about the National Library. And of course, there is that process of building a relationship, of promoting yourself with your partners, with the Irish Times team, as easy to deal with, as offering seamless access to content. And journalists are so hungry for content all the time now that that is a really valuable aspect of this. We also use the content in multiple other ways, including through working with partners, serving research communities. If you look, for example, at the Digital Repository of Ireland poster on the left-hand side of the room here, you will see National Library images featured there, as they were included in the curated 1916 Inspiring Ireland exhibition. And in reusing this imagery, so repurposing all this work that we did to identify the material, with this strong emotional impact and featuring it across our social media, in May, with a particular focus on the executed men, we had nearly 90,000 impressions for our tweets, with dynamic conversations around them on social media, including feedback and commentary and discussion with some of the descendants of the men. Alongside the visual, we also saw the potential of audio in sharing this content. Audio's impact still undeniable and perhaps more resonant than it's ever been, while also reaching into communities around Ireland. We used 16 selections from the collections that captured the feelings of a whole range of people who experienced the heightened and dramatic days around Easter 1916. It included the words of the 7 signatories themselves, but also British soldiers, members of Conul and the volunteers, and members of the British establishment in Ireland, including those who were trapped in the Lord Lieutenant's residence in the Phoenix Park. We created audio packages ready prepared for local radio stations, and we also put the extracts online. This for us was a further measure of the impact, because aside from some of the metrics I've already mentioned, the desire of local stations for more such content showed that we were reaching, in the ways that we hoped, into communities that are otherwise perhaps at quite a remove from somewhere like the National Library. So for example, you see here Ciara Kerrigan, one of my colleagues, who's been working with Louth FM, who were one of the stations who were most interested in continuing on stories around Irish genealogy, which again are firmly rooted in the story of the local, the personal, the relatable, the emotional. Seamus Heaney spent a long time in our beautiful reading room, which you can see here on Easter Monday last year, filled with people who wanted that emotional sense of being part of something bigger than themselves. And being part of something bigger than yourself can sometimes be one of the strongest feelings that comes from researching in archival collections. We're working on an exhibition about Seamus Heaney at the moment, so you can imagine his words are very much on my mind. In thinking about this presentation, some lines from Postscript kept coming back to me, capturing in a way I didn't expect the hopes we had in identifying and promoting content that would touch people and share the excitement and pleasure of research and the sense of something changing in you because of what you discovered. And I'm going to end on these lines. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass. As big soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. Thank you.